Welcome. This is the PhD dissertation defense of Dustin Ranglack, who doesn't, I've got to stand next to him because he's got a microphone that I have to talk to. So I told the video man I put my head under Dustin's armpit, but he's
I did shower this morning, so we're okay.
Anyway, it's a big day. Dustin has been associated with this department. We were just talking about it now for 11 years. So most people know him very well. I mean, he was an undergraduate here. He went off on a mission for a couple of years. He came back. He finished up his undergraduate degree. Then he worked as a technician for a year on cougar projects. Then he came back and he worked for me here for a year. Then he told me that he wanted to work on large predators for a graduate degree. And I convinced him that
really large predators.
That large was more interesting. And I consider it one of my crowning achievements in my career that I convinced him to give up on large predators and spend years crawling around in the dust, clipping dry grass, and collecting buffalo poop with a plastic spoon. And that's what he did. And he'll tell you all about it today. So he's going to need time. He's got a lot to talk about, and so I'm just going to hand right over to Dustin. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Johan. And thanks, everyone, for coming out. It's really a little overwhelming to see this amount of support here. And I am really excited to talk to you about the last 4 years of work that I've done on this bison project. It's been really interesting and eye-opening for me, so I'm excited to kind of share these results with you. So as was mentioned, I'll talk about this American bison ecology and bison-cattle interactions in the Henry Mountains in southern Utah. Wildlife-livestock conflict is truly a worldwide problem where there's a very negative perception towards our native large herbivores from a livestock producer point of view. And this generally stems from concerns over disease transmission, as well as the potential for competition between native and domestic grazers. And it's really led to the near eradication of many wildlife species. As you can see in this painting that's depicting Manifest Destiny, we have the westward expansion across the prairies, with bison here running off into the distance. And for across most of their original range, bison were never to be seen again, at least in any sort of a wild sense. Bison once numbered in the millions. As you can see on this graph here the historical bison estimates. Between 30 and 60 million bison once roamed North America. They've been largely replaced by cattle, as all of these dots here represent the cattle population in both the US and Canada. And so we can see that cattle have far outpaced where bison would have been historically. Cattle truly is the king now. And so there's a significant economic incentive to keep bison populations low to avoid competition with cattle. And so here, these triangles along the very bottom, those represent bison that are found in conservation herds, what we would consider to be wild bison, where these X's represent bison that are in commercial livestock production. Currently, there are about 500,000 bison in North America, but only about 20,000 of those are found in conservation herds. The rest of them are in livestock production herds. Of these conservation herds, many of them are facing significant challenges. They have very small population sizes. They're contained in small and fragmented landscapes, often behind fences. Many are experiencing some form of introgression with cattle genes into their genome, or they're facing disease issues like we see in the greater Yellowstone area. And really one of the main things that's limiting bison restoration at large ecologically meaningful scales is perceived competition with livestock. If you look at this map, the orange represents the original distribution of plains bison, while the yellow would be the original distribution of woods bison. And each of these dots represent the locations of conservation herds, with the relative size of the dot being indicative of the size of the population. So you can see that many of these are very small. And because of this, it's often been suggested that bison are ecologically extinct. So this dot here is where I've been working. So that's the Henry Mountains. They're located on the Colorado Plateau. This is an arid, semi-arid system, and it's extremely isolated. Essentially, you can think of this as an island mountain range surrounded by desert. And it is primarily public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and as such, it's managed for multiple use. And one of those uses is cattle grazing. In our lower elevations, we have very sparsely vegetated desert grassland and shrublands. And then as we move up, we get into pinyon juniper woodland, mixed conifer forest, and eventually subalpine grassland and aspen. Ooh, let's not do that. All right. So bison were introduced into this general area in the 1940s, and this bison population is extremely unique, as it is the only bison herd that is free-ranging, genetically pure, and disease-free. To top it off, it is also a huntable herd that's maintained through sport hunting at about 325 adults post-hunt. Now, this population size is truly the only thing that's keeping the Henry Mountains bison herd from being the crown jewel of bison conservation, as the minimum genetically viable population size for bison has been estimated to be 1,000 individuals. Now, while I certainly don't advocate for managing for 1,000 individuals in the Henry Mountains, as that would likely lead to damage to the resource base, increasing this population size would be a benefit for maintaining the genetic diversity in this herd. And one of the most unique aspects of this herd and what makes it such a valuable herd for research is that they do commingle with cattle. There's no attempt made to keep bison and cattle separate on this rangeland. The bison, they have a year-round population and a year-round presence on this landscape of about 400 individuals when we're including calves. However, the cattle, their numbers vary depending on the details of the grazing permit system. So in the summer, there are about 800 cattle permitted to graze on the Henry Mountains in the higher elevations, where in the winter that number increases to a little over 4,000 bison or cattle. Now, these numbers are what's permitted. The actual numbers are likely to be less than this, but it goes to show the relative differences, as in the winter, the bison population is only 10% of what the cattle population is. So in order for the bison to really be having negative impacts on this cattle population, those impacts would have to be very strong, simply due to the differences in relative abundance. Also, as this population is on the edge of the original distribution of bison, it's what we would likely consider to be suboptimal habitat for bison. So resources here are going to be much more limiting than they would be in the northern Great Plains, for example, where it's been described as oceans of grass. So if we're going to find competition between bison and cattle anywhere across their original distribution, it's likely that we would find it here. So this bison population has grown dramatically. We saw a period of exponential growth, and it's leveled off at about 400 individuals the last 25 years or so, as shown by these closed circles, which indicate the count that's conducted by the UDWR every year. This dashed line represents the harvesting threshold that this population has managed for since 1983. So they try to bring the population down to that level every year post-hunt. And then the open circles along the bottom are the number of animals that have been removed either through hunter harvest or live removals to establish new herds, as was done here in the late 2000s. That peak corresponds with when bison were reintroduced into the Book Cliffs. But there has been a lot of conflict, especially as this bison population has grown. There's been concern over the accuracy of the counts, and Pat Terletsky addressed a lot of that in her PhD, as a lot of that variation that you saw in the last 25 years or so is beyond what is biologically possible for such a large, long-lived species as a bison. Additionally, competition for forage is of major concern. As you can see, bison have a very conspicuous presence on the landscape. They have a very large body size. They create these large dust wallows, very large cattle-like dung pats. You certainly know when you're in an area that the bison have been to. And so there's this real perception that bison are strong competitors with cattle in the area. Additionally, there's concern over summertime grazing by bison in allotments that are designated for cattle winter use. But essentially, the local community is receiving no benefit from this bison population, so they have no reason to view the bison as anything but a detriment to their livestock production operations. And so we've seen this conflict. Here, the red bars are times that the Henry Mountains bison conflict has been mentioned in the Deseret News, the Salt Lake City newspaper. And the yellow are times when it's been mentioned in the Utah State Legislature. And you can see we have two distinct peaks in the early 90s and the late 2000s. And both of these generally correspond with periods of below average rainfall. As you can see, the blue line is our annual precip, and the dashed line is our mean annual precip. So when rainfall is more limiting, there's fewer resources in this, so there's a higher perception of competition. But there are other wildlife species here in the Henry Mountains. There's a trophy mule deer population, as you can see here, that makes a lot of hunters very happy. We have very small populations of elk and antelope on the Henry Mountains. And additionally, there are lagomorphs, both black-tailed jackrabbits and desert cottontail rabbits. Now, while these are much smaller in body size, and due to their nocturnal nature, generally you don't notice them, when you walk around in the Henry Mountain area, you really see a lot of fecal pellets down on the ground from lagomorphs. And so we felt like maybe these lagomorphs were having significant impacts on the rangeland. As far as predators, we have both cougars and coyotes that have a permanent presence on the Henry Mountains. However, they are intensively controlled through predator removals, primarily to benefit this mule deer population. So our objectives were to measure the potential for competition at both the patch and the habitat scale. And I say potential competition as opposed to measuring competition, simply because to measure competition, you need a measure of fitness. And a measure of fitness is beyond the scale of a 3-year study. You'd need a much longer time frame. We also wanted to look at, to compare herd structure and activity of bison across habitats and seasons in an attempt to use bison as a bioindicator of habitat quality. And finally, we'll present one management option. So give you a little guide of where we're going. I'll start out with some of the general methods that we used. Then we'll jump into the key results for each of these chapters, going into detail on how I used grazing exclosures to measure patch scale competition, habitat overlap, and then using bison as bioindicators, and our management option. We'll just kind of hit the highlights of those. And then I'll wrap things up with a brief conclusion. So we used a combination of various methods to really get a great deal of detail on this bison herd. We had exclosure sites we monitored for 1 year. 47 different bison wore a GPS collar at some point during this 3-year period of time, 28 females and 19 males. We had direct observation of nearly 200 groups of bison for approximately 170 hours of activity data. And that was primarily focused during the summer field seasons, those observations. However, I did make visits to the Henry Mountains throughout the remainder of the seasonal cycle. Those were just more limited due to responsibilities at the university. And finally, fecal samples, as Johan mentioned, from 40 different groups of bison, 150 samples that were collected over the course of 1 year. So over these next 4 slides, you're going to see over 82,000 GPS locations that were collected during this 3-year period, broken down by season. To help orient you a little bit here, this area is the high elevation areas. That's what we would consider to be the Henry Mountains when you're thinking about that. Capitol Reef National Park runs here immediately to the west. And then we have the communities of Hanksville, just up here off the map, as well as Torrey, Bicknell, and Loa over here. So those are where our main ranching communities are located. During the springtime, we see the bison really concentrating their use in these low elevation canyons, as well as in this area here, which was this area burned in 2003 as part of the Bulldog Fire. When we move into the summer, we see them really transition their range northward. All of these points in the higher elevations are taking advantage of naturally occurring open areas, as well as areas that have been mechanically treated to improve foraging conditions through chaining, which is essentially where you take 2 bulldozers, connect them with an anchor chain, and drive them parallel through a pinyon juniper stand to open up the canopy and release the understory from competition by killing all those junipers. So that's what these are. And then you'll notice this large concentration here. This is what I've been mentioning with the concern over summertime grazing by bison in cattle winter allotments, is this area is designated for cattle winter use. And over the past 15 years or so, the bison have really used this area heavily during the summertime. Fall is a real period of transition for the bison as they really spread out across their entire range as they're moving from the northern portion back down to the southern portion. However, we do see continued use in this cattle winter allotment during this time. And then finally into the winter, we see them finish their shift southward, taking advantage of low elevation mesa tops as well as that burned area again. And now we'll just go full circle into the spring. You've already seen this before, but you can kind of see how they transition back to the north. So like I said, we gathered a great deal of detail on the bison and what the bison were doing. Unfortunately, it was impossible to put GPS collars on the cattle as well. And so to understand what the cattle were doing, we sent out a questionnaire to the 21 ranchers who graze cattle in the area that's used by bison. And we asked them, what are their biggest concerns with bison and cattle? What are the biggest issues? Are they competition for forage, competition for water, competition for space, disease issues, etc.? We asked them to rate the important habitat types for their cattle in each season as high, medium, and low. And then we averaged those to come up with a ranked list of habitat types. We asked them about the main wildlife competitors. Is it bison, mule deer, or lagomorphs? And finally, 2 questions about predator control. First, if it should be done, and second, which species received the most benefit from it, both wild and domestic. So now we'll jump into that first chapter. Here's where I'm using grazing exclosures to look at competition at the patch scale. So for our rancher survey, we had 12 responses, so a 57% response rate. However, those 12 ranchers do hold the grazing permits for nearly 71% of the cattle that graze in this area. And competition for forage was by far the biggest concern, and really their only concern in this area of any significance. As far as wildlife competitors, it's truly bison and then everything else. As bison were consistently a medium or high level competitor, where both deer and lagomorphs were consistently low, with little variation around these. And then all felt that coyotes should be controlled and that the benefit was primarily for the wildlife species. So for our predictions at the patch scale, if we're seeing competition, first, if bison are significantly reducing forage availability for cattle, we would expect bison visitation to any particular site to be a significant predictor of grass biomass depletion. So the longer period of time that bison stay in an area, the more grass they're eating, essentially. And second, if bison are the main wildlife competitor with cattle for these grazing resources, we would expect bison and cattle to be the 2 predominant grass consumers in the system. So like I said, we set up a series of exclosure sites. These were all placed in this grazing allotment, which if you remember, that's where we saw those real heavy concentration of bison locations in the summer and fall. Each of these, so we placed 20 exclosure sites in here using a list of randomly generated GPS locations that were between 50 and 200 meters from the nearest road to allow for access, setup, and monitoring, at least 100 meters from the next nearest site, and in areas that were relatively flat and consistently vegetated. At each of these 20 sites, we set up one 8x8 exclosure that would exclude bison and cattle but allow lagomorphs to have access, a second 8x8 exclosure that would exclude bison, cattle, and lagomorphs, and finally an open reference plot that would allow access for all grazers, for a total of 40 exclosures and 20 reference plots. So this is how each site was laid out. We have our partial exclosure, so our lagomorphs have access to the interior here, but our bison and cattle are kept outside. Our full exclosure that excludes bison, cattle, and lagomorphs, and then our open reference plot, which is available for all. These were set up in October of 2011. I returned 1 year later, and we clipped the standing crop of vegetation and separated it into grass, forb, shrub, and cactus. And all of that was then dried and weighed for analysis. And I'm just going to talk about grass for the rest of the time now, as we found no significant differences in our forb, shrub, or cactus communities. So to give you an idea of what these look like, this is one particular site, number 19, and this is an area that the ranchers have taken me to and really identified as an area of concern, that they feel like the bison are having a very strong negative impact at this site. So you can see that these are constructed using T-posts and cattle panels. The mesh on these is large enough to allow lagomorphs to have access on the partial exclosure. The full is exactly the same design. It's just skirted with chicken wire that goes 2 feet up the side and then 2 feet out the bottom to keep the lagomorphs from being able to burrow under. So this is what it looked like when it was set up. And when we returned 1 year later, this is what we saw. So if you look at the inside of the partial compared to the outside of the partial, that is your large herbivore effect, or bison and cattle, essentially. Where if you're comparing the inside of the full exclosure to the inside of the partial exclosure, that shows you the lagomorph effect, which this particular site appears to be significant. So for our predictions, if you remember, the first was that bison visitation would be a significant predictor of grass biomass depletion. We were able to use the GPS telemetry to really quantify the use of each of these areas, as each of these black dots represents one bison location that was collected just during that year that these exclosures were being monitored. So you can see we did a very good job of placing these exclosures in areas that are actually used by bison, as well as capturing variation in use, as some areas were used quite heavily and others much less so. And just for reference, that number 19 that I showed you pictures of is here near the top. So to quantify bison use at each of these sites, we used a relative density index, where essentially we created a half square kilometer buffer around each of these sites and counted the number of bison locations that we collected within that buffer. That was then divided by the average number of bison locations you would expect in any given half square kilometer of that habitat type. It was log transformed for analysis, so basically any RDIs greater than 0 would indicate higher than expected bison use, and RDIs less than 0 would be lower than expected bison use. So this is what our prediction would show. Essentially, as we see increasing bison use, we should see increasing grass biomass depletion, so this positive relationship. And grass biomass depletion is essentially the difference between the partial exclosure and the reference plot. But this is what we actually observed. If anything, there's a slightly negative relationship here, but it's not significant when running a linear regression. So we can see that bison visitation is not a significant predictor of grass biomass depletion, but there's something else that's really driving this system. So our second prediction was that bison and cattle would be the two predominant grass consumers. To do this, we used a one-way randomized block design, ANOVA, where we used the site as a random block to control for variation between sites. And we did find significant differences among the reference, partial, and full exclosure types. Essentially, by excluding large herbivores, that results in a 13.9 gram per square meter increase in grass biomass, with the additional exclusion of lagomorphs resulting in an additional 7.2 grams per square meter of grass biomass, both of which are significant. But the real question here is how much of this 13.9 grams per square meter is due to bison and how much of it is due to cattle. So here we used animal days to determine the relative impacts of each. Now, bison and cattle in the Henry Mountains have over a 90% dietary overlap in a study done by Dirk van Vuren in the 1970s. They're also very similar in body size, and so their daily consumption rates are likely to be roughly equal. In fact, the BLM does consider them to be equals in this area, using a 1-to-1 ratio when reallocating forage from one to the other. So for our bison, we used our GPS collar data to determine that there were roughly 21,500 bison days of use in this particular grazing allotment during that year. Where for our cattle, we used the on and off dates, as well as the actual number of cattle that were released into the allotment as verified by the producers, to determine that there were about 82,000 cattle days of use in that allotment during this time frame. So if we break down that 13.9 gram per square meter by the number of animal days for each species, we can see that cattle are consuming 11 grams per square meter of grass biomass. Lagomorph 7.2, as I showed before, and then bison 2.9. So for our prediction, we can see that bison and cattle are not the two predominant grass consumers, but it's actually lagomorphs and cattle as your main grass consumers in the system. When we break it down on a percentage basis, you can see that of all the grass that's being consumed, a little over half is being eaten by cattle, a little over a third by lagomorphs, and just less than 14% by bison. So our lagomorph impact is more than double what our bison impact is in this allotment. So at the patch scale, we can see that bison are not driving grass depletion, and cattle are actually facing a far greater competitive threat from lagomorphs than they are from bison, contrary to the perceptions of the local community and myself. I certainly did not believe that there would be that strong of an impact. So we're seeing very little evidence of competition between bison and cattle at the patch scale, at least in this one particular allotment. But it's important to now scale that up and look across the entire Henry Mountain Range using that GPS data to see if there's the potential for competition at the habitat scale. So here, our first objective was just to look at overall habitat preference for bison. And to do that, we used a chi-square contingency table with simultaneous 95% Bonferroni confidence intervals to essentially tell us if a certain habitat type is being used in equal proportion to its availability or if it's being used significantly more or significantly less than it's available on the landscape. Second, we did a comparison of habitat needs for both bison and cattle using Spearman rank correlation. And for bison, we used a resource selection function framework to generate a ranked list of habitat preference for each season, from most to least preferred. And for cattle, we used the results of that rancher survey, which gave us a ranked list of cattle habitat preferences. And so Spearman rank allows us to compare these two otherwise unrelated data types by comparing the ranks of these habitat types as opposed to the actual raw values. So as far as bison habitat preference, we have this for each sex and season. And so zeros are indicating that this area is being used in equal proportion to its availability. Positive signs indicate that it's being used significantly more than that landscape is available on the than that habitat type is available on the landscape. And negatives indicate that it's being used significantly less than the habitat is available on the landscape. I want to just bring your attention to a few things. First, with barren ground, we see consistently negative. And this is important just because it shows that this method is working. Because if we saw any sort of a neutral or positive preference for barren ground, that would start raising immediate red flags, as there would be no reason ecologically for bison to prefer those areas. Second, pinyon juniper is also consistently negative. And I bring this up to kind of set things up for Chapter 3, as woody plant encroachment into foraging areas is a worldwide problem, as we've seen changes in disturbance regimes. And here in the West, that's primarily pinyon juniper woodlands. And so often this is, we use different treatments, both burning as well as mechanical treatments, to combat woody plant encroachment and open up these foraging areas again. So we can see that when we're working with pinyon juniper, bison have a consistently negative preference. However, when we compare that to those different treatment types, both burns and chainings, we see that preference switch to generally being a positive preference. So that shows the value of some of these different habitat treatments. And we'll talk more about that in Chapter 3. So if we're seeing bison and cattle competing at a habitat scale, we would expect to see significant correlation between bison habitat preferences, as reported through the resource selection function values, and our rancher-reported cattle habitat needs. We'd expect to see this on an annual basis, just overall, as well as when we break it down by season, we should see the strongest correlation in the winter, as that season should be the most limiting, as the annual grasses have died off and the perennial grasses have translocated nutrients down into their root systems. And finally, due to the concern over summertime grazing by bison in cattle winter allotments, we compared the summer bison to cattle winter use to see if there's a correlation there. So what we would expect to see is a very tight correlation with the most important habitat types for bison being closely matched up to the most important habitat types for cattle, on down to the least preferred habitat types as well. Now, it's important to note here that Spearman rank correlation doesn't take into account where in this ranking the correlation occurs. Matches at the bottom are weighted equally to matches at the top, where ecologically, those top 4 or 5 habitat types are probably of real importance to the bison and cattle, where the remaining, the back half of these rankings, the exact order that these habitats are appearing is of less importance, such that like the difference between an 8 and a 12 is probably pretty minimal, but the difference between a 3 and a 7 is probably fairly ecologically meaningful, even though that gap is still just 4 ranks. So because of that, if we were to see a tight correlation at the top part of the rankings, but then see that these points are less correlated on the back, we would still consider that to be evidence of competition. Again, bearing in mind that due to the relatively small population size of bison compared to cattle, we would need to see these to be fairly closely matched. So this is what we see when we look at this on an annual basis. This is marginally significant statistically. However, much of our correlation is in the middle to the back half of these rankings, while the front is fairly spread out, as the number 2 most important habitat type for bison on an annual basis is aspen woodland, where that was ranked as number 8 for cattle. So while this is marginally significant statistically, we expect that the ecological significance of this is likely less than that p-value would indicate. When we look at this on a seasonal basis, we don't see any significant correlation in any season except for the fall. Remember, we expected to see the strongest correlation in the winter, and that season we see no significant correlation. In the fall, if you remember from when I was showing you those GPS locations, that's really a period of transition for the bison as they're moving from their north to their southern range. Really, anytime you're having a period of transition, at some point you're going to match up. So if our cattle habitat needs are here, as the bison are transitioning from the north to the south, it's likely that they're going to cross over at some point. So that would help to explain why we're seeing this correlation in the fall. And then finally, when we compare the temporal disconnect of summer bison versus winter cattle, again, we're seeing some tighter correlation in the back than we are in the front. So despite the marginal significance statistically, the ecological significance would be less than the p-value is indicating. So we can see that we're not finding significant correlation on an annual basis. We don't see the strongest correlation in the winter, but in fact the fall during that period of transition. And we don't see correlation in our summer bison versus winter cattle. So overall, we find very little evidence of competition at the habitat scale. And when we can combine this information with the grazing exposure information, it becomes very apparent that competition between bison and cattle in this system has been overstated. So now we'll move into chapter 3. Here we're attempting to use bison as a bioindicator of habitat quality. As I mentioned before, habitat manipulations are often used to improve foraging conditions for both wild and domestic ungulates. And we see this used commonly to combat woody plant encroachment. Now, the success of these different treatments, if it's measured at all, is generally measured simply in an increase in forage abundance. However, if the grazing animals are not responding to that increase, it's likely unsuccessful regardless of how much more forage is there. So here we're proposing to using ideal free distribution theory, we can test habitat quality by monitoring herd structure, activity, and fecal indicators. Specifically for this, we use fecal nitrogen, which is an index of dietary quality. Now, the ideal free distribution theory states that if animals are free to distribute themselves across the rangeland, they have knowledge of all these different foraging patches, that they will distribute themselves accordingly to habitat quality, such that the highest quality habitats will have the largest group sizes, they'll have more mixed groups as opposed to sexually segregated groups. These groups will spend more of their time feeding and less of their time moving, as in these high quality habitats they're just going to be foraging, where low quality habitats are likely just passing through, going to the next high quality area. And bison really are the ideal species to use for this, simply because anyone who's worked with bison knows that you can get a bison to go anywhere as long as the bison wants to go there. They are truly free to distribute themselves across this landscape, and no one and nothing can keep them from accessing a particular habitat type or foraging patch if that's where they want to be. They've been seen at all elevations and slopes, and they truly will sample this habitat completely. So we would expect that they would distribute themselves according to the predictions of the ideal free distribution theory. So we would make a series of predictions. First, because our manipulated habitat, these habitat manipulations are done to improve foraging conditions, we would expect that our manipulated habitats to be of higher quality than our unmanipulated habitats, which in this case we just classified as either open or closed when we're looking at fecal nitrogen. Second, we expect group size, competition, and activity level to vary along a gradient of habitat quality. And finally, we expect our burnings to be of higher quality than our chainings. And this is simply due to the fact that while both of these treatment types will open up the canopy and release the understory from competition, burning also provides a nutrient pulse into the system that may provide for higher quality forage. However, I should mention that in this case, the burns that we were monitoring were those same burns that I showed on the maps. These areas burned in 2003 as part of the Bulldog Fire. So these are 10 years old. So it may be possible that we're no longer seeing the effects of this. So first, when we look at diet quality, again, this is using fecal nitrogen, we see significantly higher nitrogen concentrations in our burned habitats than we do in our other 3 habitat types. Now, we expect that this closed value is actually lower than what we're reporting here, simply because our GPS data and our activity data show that when bison are in these closed habitat types, they are generally just passing through. So if we collected a fecal sample in a closed habitat type, it's likely from forage that was grazed in one of these other 3 habitat types. So we expect that would actually be lower. But you can see that chaining essentially creates the equivalent of a naturally occurring open habitat type, where burn does provide a higher quality forage even 10 years later. Second, here we're looking just by season, and we can see that our early season is of higher quality than our late, as according to fecal nitrogen. And again, this is used just as a test to show that this is working, simply because we expect that due to the spring green up, that forage in the springtime would be of higher quality than what we would see later in the year as these plants start to senesce. When we look at group size and composition, we see no differences in group size or composition when we break it down by those 4 habitat types. However, when we look at it by season, we do see significantly more mixed groups as opposed to sexually segregated groups in our late season, as well as larger group sizes during that time. And finally, for our activity data, here we just looked at the amount of time spent feeding versus moving. And we quantified that as the percent of the foraging time, so all the time that was spent either feeding or moving, that is designated to feeding. So these higher values indicate that they're mostly feeding, lower values would indicate that they're mostly moving. And this, I need to mention, this asterisk is indicating that these are significant at a 0.1 level as opposed to a 0.05. So this is to be interpreted as marginally significant. So we're seeing marginal differences between the amount of time spent feeding between our burned and our closed, with them spending more time feeding in a burned area as opposed to a closed area. However, if you remember, that burned habitat type is used primarily during the winter and spring. And that's when my visits to the Henry Mountains were less frequent. And I was often limited in access to this area due to snow or rainfall during that time that I came down. So our sample size for this burned habitat type is much lower than for these others. So we expect that with larger sample size, we would see a greater differentiation between these habitat types. So for our predictors, we are seeing that our manipulated is of higher quality than our unmanipulated habitat types, at least for the burns, not so for the chainings, which they're essentially equal to a naturally occurring open area. We don't see any difference in group size or composition with habitat. However, we are seeing these marginal differences in activity along a gradient of habitat quality. And finally, fecal nitrogen is showing that even though these burns are 10 years old, we're still seeing higher quality forage in our burns as opposed to our chainings. Not so with group size or composition or activity, as there was no significant differences between our burn and our chain in that feeding to moving ratio. However, with larger sample size, we may have seen that. So this is basically showing that it is possible to detect differences in habitat quality by monitoring bison activity, as opposed to going out and making a series of measurements and collecting samples of the vegetation. And as generally the concern is, does this improve the forage quality and the foraging area for both wildlife and livestock, this may prove to be a more effective means of determining that. We are seeing that our burns are providing higher quality than our chainings, which is important from a manager's perspective to understand that. However, it is surprising that we're seeing these differences still persist 10 years later. And we have several different possible explanations as to why this is the case. First, for both burnings and chainings, these areas are generally reseeded following the treatment. And this definitely was the case with this fire in 2003. And when we look at the seed mix, we see it was reseeded with a combination of several different wheatgrass species as well as alfalfa. Now, given that these seeds would land in an area in the absence of competition, as all the vegetation has been burned, as well as they can take advantage of that nutrient pulse, we may have seen a great deal of germination, and that we actually established a higher quality plant forage community than what would have existed there before. where in the chainings, even if these areas are reseeded as well, those seeds are having to compete with the existing forage, as well as they're not able to take advantage of that nutrient pulse. Another and very real possibility is that we're seeing the establishment of a grazing lawn in this area, which is very well documented in African systems especially. If during that immediate nutrient pulse that we saw after the fire, during the first 3 or 4 months, so we would expect that nutrient pulse to persist, if bison really concentrated their use in this area during that time, that would lead to a very concentrated inputs of dung and urine that could then continue to maintain this area in a level of higher nutritional quality, and that the bison would continue to respond to, continue to concentrate their use, continue to concentrate these urine and dung inputs. And so we've seen this area maintained in a higher quality state as we've established this grazing lawn. Finally, is that there just might be some differences, pre-existing differences in these habitat types to begin with. Between our burns and our chains is our main comparison here. But when we look at GIS layers of slope, elevation aspect, as well as the pre-burn plant community, as far as land cover types, we're finding very little differences between our chained areas and our burned areas, at least where the bison were using these areas. So we don't believe that to be the case, but we likely are seeing some combination of those first two potential explanations happening here, and that's what's explaining this continued higher quality forage in this area. And finally, just to present one possible management option, one of many possible management options for this area. We've seen that competition has been overstated between bison and cattle in the system. However, the local community receives no benefit from the bison, and that's a lot of what's leading to this conflict. Now, things that don't change stay the same. So if they continue to receive no benefit, there's likely no reason for them to change their perceptions of bison, and so we'll likely just see this conflict continue to persist through time. So here, we demonstrated the feasibility of a bison benefit program that would provide a direct benefit to the local community so that they become true partners in conserving this bison population and hopefully reducing the amount of conflict, while also allowing for an increase in bison population, which, if you remember, I mentioned before, if not for nothing else but purely genetic reasons, would be valuable. But it may be valuable just when we're thinking about bison conservation on a continental scale. Currently, the only source of disease-free and genetically pure bison for reintroductions and establishment of new conservation herds is Elk Island National Park in Canada. So if we were to increase this bison population to a point where we could use excess animals from it to establish new herds, that would be tremendously valuable for bison conservation. So all of this would really lead to an increase in the social ecological resilience of this entire system, allowing it to adapt to potential shocks and changes in the environment. So how would this work? First, the Division of Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, and the Henry Mountain Grazing Association would have to get together and decide on a mutually agreeable population objective for the Henry Mountains bison herd. And the population would then be incrementally increased to that level. In order to do this and not damage our range resource, we want to see a commensurate reduction in cattle stocking rates so that the overall density of bison and cattle is not changing. We've shown that at the current densities that we're seeing, competition is minimal. And so it'd be smart to maintain that current density overall. However, those ranchers who are destocking are going to have to graze their cattle somewhere. And so they're likely going to have to purchase grazing rights somewhere else. So the effective ranchers would be compensated through the auction of a bison tag or tags. Now in 2014, a bison tag for the Henry Mountains sold for $19,000. So there is a significant economic value here that can be used. And then any remaining funds would be used to provide a fund of bison benefits that would be used for community development. Now this could be for scholarships for local students, improving local infrastructure, could go into the school systems into the area. But this is set up so that no individual is deriving profit. The affected ranchers are being compensated on a pro rata basis, as well as the community is receiving a benefit, but no one individual is going to derive profit from this, which is important. So how does this actually work? We kind of crunched some numbers, and let's just say, for example's sake, that the DWR, BLM, and the Henry Mountain Grazing Association decides that they want to manage for a population of 400 bison. If we're assuming a conservative hunting rate of 16%, which over the last 30 years, the actual hunting rate has been 20% removal. So if we're assuming a harvest rate is 16%, that would indicate that our pre-hunt population size is 476 bison. So there are 76 bison that are available for removal every year, compared to currently, which would be estimated at 62. However, by increasing the herd size by 75, you're going to have to remove 75 cattle, essentially. And so that's 900 AUMs, animal unit months, which is how the BLM measures forage. 900 AUMs would have to be purchased somewhere else for those cattle to graze. And at 2013 market rates, that would cost $13,000. Now, for this exercise, we arbitrarily designated 2 bison tags for auction and assumed that they would sell for that $19,000 that they sold this year. However, in practice, this could be 2, it could be 6. It could really vary. So if we auction those 2 tags and pay the cost, the resulting is a nearly $25,000 annual benefit for this community. So the community is definitely going to have an incentive to kind of change their beliefs about bison and start to view them as an asset as opposed to a detriment. While there are 14 additional animals available every year for both more hunting opportunity as well as for live removals to establish herds in other parts of Utah or throughout North America. But there are very real challenges to this, and we recognize that. This represents a dramatic change from the North American model of wildlife conservation that has been so successful in bringing many of our iconic wildlife species, including bison, back from the brink of extinction. And it's really, it's considered to be one of the best wildlife management models there is. But this really is kind of taking cues from community-based conservation that we see very commonly in the developing world and integrating that into the currently existing North American model framework. It would also require the reduction of cattle grazing, which is likely to be met with resistance in this local community. So if this were to be adapted, we would recommend that it be done in an adaptive management framework with facilitation from outside experts in environmental policy and environmental economics to ensure that the needs and goals of this system are being achieved, and also allow for periods where this can be reevaluated and revert back to the status quo if it's found to not be successful. But overall, we feel like this study in general provides real hope for bison restoration. As I mentioned before, if bison and cattle are going to be competing anywhere across the current range of bison, it would be happening in the Henry Mountains, as this is more of a suboptimal habitat. So while at current densities we're not seeing any competition here, it provides hope that we can maintain bison and cattle together on a landscape and not have to keep them separate without negatively impacting local communities and perhaps enhancing that local economy. Some of the future work that I will be doing next month, I'll be traveling to Texas A&M University to work with Jim Durr in his genetics lab to analyze samples that we collected from all of our collared bison for both heterozygosity, which is a measure of genetic diversity, as well as to look at the level if there are any introgression of cattle genes. Now, I mentioned before that these are considered to be genetically pure. However, that was done looking at just 12 microsatellite loci, and we're going to look at a much larger panel of microsatellites to determine if that still holds true. And the diversity is important, as I mentioned, this herd is being managed well below the minimum genetically viable population size. So it may show that we need to bring in some additional individuals from another bison herd to act as a form of genetic rescue and help increase our overall genetic diversity. And if you're going to do that, and you know that you have genetically pure bison, it's very important that the individuals you're bringing in are also genetically pure. I'll also be looking at stress levels here at USU with Susanna French, using those same fecal samples that we analyzed for fecal nitrogen. We're going to look at fecal glucocorticoids to see if we're seeing any sort of physiological trade-off. The fact that the bison are congregating in these low elevation areas during the summer and fall is very unusual, as this is a much more sparsely vegetated area, as well as just much drier. And we would expect that the forage quality is much better in these higher elevations. But bison may be selecting for these areas due to lower stress, simply because the human activity in these low elevation areas is much lower during the summer than in the high elevation, where we get a lot of recreationists going to look at those trophy mule deer bucks in the high country. So they may actually be selecting for lower stress levels as opposed to higher forage quality. So I'd like to thank my advisor, Johan Dutoit, for all of his help and support, as well as my committee members, Peter Adler, Morgan Ernest, Frank Howe, and Dave Coons, for all their comments and help and suggestions throughout this PhD process. Many thanks go out to my field techs, with whom I wouldn't have been able to accomplish this, Jake Thurston and Aaron Wampole, as well as a host of volunteers who helped me set up the grazing exclosure sites, which I'm really appreciative of. I also need to thank a host of people at the UDWR and the BLM office in Hanksville for all of their support and really helping me to understand this particular bison population and how it works and what this conflict is, as well as for all their logistical support and equipment and coming to save me when we had mechanical breakdowns, and just their friendship in general. They've been great. And finally, the Henry Mountain Grazing Association. We showed that many of their perceptions have been overstated as far as bison and cattle competition. However, these ranchers have been very helpful throughout the entire course of this study in helping me to understand their perspective. And I have a great deal of respect for them and for what they do. And to this point, they've been very receptive to the results that we presented them. So I'm very grateful for them and their friendship, and I have a great deal of respect for them and for what they do. Thank you.